The tools of the past still look to the heavens and to the future, and it's happening today in Fayette. The story starts in 1875. Ulysses S. Grant was president. An aspiring young scientist named Tesla first enrolled in college to study mechanics and the new field of electrical engineering, and Jesse James was still an active outlaw in Missouri. In fact, he even robbed a train in Otterville that year. It's also the year the Morrison Observatory opened, although it would be a while until that had anything to do with Fayette. What would eventually make the trains run on time, keep time for much of the country, and advance the world's understanding of astronomy started as a request to a friend from C.W. Pritchett.
When Pritchett had the school in Glasgow, the Pritchett Academy, there was a good friend of his, Beatrice Morrison. She was a fairly wealthy lady, and they got to know each other, and they would go out at night and watch the stars. And Pritchett was explaining to her the stars and the moons and the planets and all these wonderful things that you couldn't see. And she asked, well, what would, and he would talk to her about the observatories that he had when he was in school and college. And she basically asked him, says, well, what would it take to build an observatory? And he goes, oh, a lot of money, $100,000. And so she goes, okay. So she pledged the money to build the observatory. And in 1920s, Central College at that time acquired the assets and the observatory in 1920 something, late 1920s. It was moved here to Fayette.
The Morrison Observatory opened with a brand new Clark telescope, which is still being used today. More on that in just a moment. A year after opening, the observatory added another telescope. This one is a Meridian telescope. It's smaller than the Clark, but it had an important job that impacted much of the Midwest.
Pritchett, he would sit and watch and look through the eyepiece, and as the star crossed the meridian, he had basically a clicker or a key that he would click as the star crossed each one of the crosshairs in the eyepiece. That would in turn mark the chronograph, which is basically a stopwatch, and then check that against the clock. And if there was any time difference that he could see, then he would correct the clock. This clock would close a telegraph key so that the railroad station in Alton, Illinois would get an audible click on their telegraph. Then the telegraph operator would make sure that their clock there was at the correct time, and then all the conductors that came in would make sure that their pocket watches coincided with that clock at the station.
Pritchett College closed down in 1922, and 4 years later, the Morrison Observatory was moved and rebuilt in Fayette as part of what's now Central Methodist College. Now today, space exploration is mostly digital, of course, but the work done all those years ago is still impressive today. Even understanding the limits of yesterday's technology required an exact science.
The telescope is a very carefully built instrument, and they knew when they built it that it was subject to a great number of errors. Gravity would bow the telescope. They had methods of checking to see how much gravity pulled down on it. They wouldn't just take one reading, they would take 4 readings, and every time you took a second reading, you would cut your chances of error in half. So you could reduce your chances of error down to 1/4.
There was one stipulation back then, though, that keeps the experience of deep space available to you in the present day.
And when Bernice Morrison gave the money to have it built, one of the stipulations was it will always be open to the public, not just for education, but always for the public.
Now, about that Clark telescope. It was cutting-edge technology then, and in fact, much of what's in today's science textbooks when it comes to astronomy was discovered using it right here in Missouri.
It was one of the major instruments of its time. When the lens was built, it was the 4th largest telescope in the United States. When it was assembled down in Glasgow, it was the 7th largest telescope. So it was a major observatory at that time. That type of telescope is still thought of as a planetary telescope, which is mostly what was being studied at that time, studying the planets. Carl Waller-Pritchett was the first person with that telescope to study the Great Red Spot on Jupiter. He was the one that named it the Great Red Spot. So it did a lot of research on planets, comets, things like that, a lot of teaching.
In fact, the Clark telescope is still an impressive instrument that remains in use today. Almost 140 years later, college students still look through it to learn, and schools bring children to the observatory as well for an experience they hope will inspire an interest in exploration and science.
Everything you look at through a telescope is in the past. Andromeda Galaxy is 2.2 million light years away. So when you look at it and you're looking at another spiral galaxy like our own, and then you tell them that light traveled 2.2 million years to get to the back of your eye, I mean, people are just stunned. I'm looking 2.2 million years into the past. It becomes an awesome thought that I know a lot of people ponder once they get home.
The Morrison Observatory is open to the public on specific dates in September, October, and November each year. Heaven may not be a place on earth, but in Missouri, we've got a place on earth that brings you closer to the heavens.